Just when I thought that open access only had to do with getting journals for free without subscription, I got to learn that it is more than that. That's why there's a difference between open science and open access. I also got to ask Dr. Tshiamo, who was part of the panel in the opening session, and he's the director of AOP, which is African Open Science Platform. But Doctor, can you please introduce yourself?
Thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Tshiamo Motshegwa. I'm the director for the African Open Science Platform, a very exciting initiative based at NRF to really coordinate advancement of open science in the whole continent of Africa. So NRF is hosting this because South Africa bid to host the initiative for Africa in South Africa. But we do have the modality where we have offices in different parts of the continent. What you hear today is a conference around one pillar of open science, which is really to do with open scientific knowledge. There are other pillars of open science that we shared yesterday in the presentation. For example, there's the issue of opening up infrastructures that we have. Not everybody can invest in infrastructures. How do we, for example, open up those infrastructures? There's the issue of engaging societal stakeholders, because the notion of open science is also premised on science changing lives. How do we engage societal actors in terms of this open science? More importantly for Africa, there is also the pillar regarding engaging other knowledge systems. So really what you are hearing today is just one aspect of those set of pillars, especially given that there is need for countries to advance all these pillars as per the UNESCO recommendations.
Okay, so I feel like you've already went to my second question, which was, can you please break down what is AOP and how did it came about?
A very good question. A set of member states at the UNESCO level, 193 countries, work together to frame what is called the UNESCO recommendation. They agreed on what open science is. And there are some key recommendations therein, including some key elements that each country needs to advance. And this will be reported every 4 years. For example, each government must aim to develop legislations or policy or strategies to really advance this. So policy implementations. Secondly, countries must aim to also try to invest in infrastructure. Yeah? It's very, very important because countries, as part of their planning, can advance science, and infrastructure is one of them. Thirdly, this notion of having the right culture to do open science is critical. We must have mechanisms to advance this change of culture. And critically, capacity building regarding open science. How do we capacitate stakeholders, researchers to do open science? And critical also the issue of us collaborating nationally, regionally, and in the continent through projects that can advance open science. You can see all these pillars needs to be implemented, and we needed a mechanism in the continent to work together to advance these pillars. If South Africa is making progress in elements of open science, this should also maybe benefit other parts of the continent, vice versa. So the African Open Science Platform is a platform that works continentally to try to really coordinate efforts in the continent. There's pockets of very good excellence, as you can imagine, in the continent, but sometimes we don't even know who's doing what. So AOSP really tries to coordinate what we do in the continent, and most critical, to amplify what we do. So we're more of a coordinating open science diplomacy platform to really get us to move along together in advance of open science. Of course, to do this, we have a strategy of how to do it, and that strategy has elements of it and is publicly available. And it was developed over time through consultations, all the relevant stakeholders in the continent. So it's nothing that just came yesterday. It has been consulted on since, I think, 2016, culminating in the call for someone to host the coordinating office, which is why we have it at NRF in South Africa. Now, I think it's very critical to appreciate the different elements of the strategy. First and foremost, we think infrastructure is critical to support open science, because not everyone can invest in infrastructure. We are talking to those service providers that has got infrastructure mandates to see how, for example, continentally, they can collectively, through some modalities, provide access to infrastructure. Very important. Secondly, the issue of policies. Everybody is asking, how do we develop these policies? So we need policy advice. UNESCO, for example, and other entities can provide expertise to work with countries and regions to develop policies. So we are very interested as AOSP to work with these regions and countries in advancement of policy. The third pillar is really research data management. There's also a gap there. How can we, for example, with work those that have got skills to do research data management to help those that don't? That's the first big pillar. This hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure. The second pillar, which is very, very important, open science must be also used to advance African priorities, whether it's in agriculture, whether it's in food security, whether it's in disaster risk reduction. We need projects through which we can then advance these good practices of open science. So immediately we are also looking at how we can coordinate to get expertise in the continent to engage together to work on projects that we can use as conduits for advancing open science. So that's the second pillar, projects. The third pillar that I think is critical is the development of networks of conversations around open science, which is why we're here. If a conference is happening in South Africa, people in North Africa should know about it. It can only happen if we have a network of dialogue.
True.
These networks must also involve other stakeholders, societal stakeholders. How do we engage them in the issues of open science? If you think, for example, citizen science, which is engaging societal actors in terms of science, is also critical. We can have these things in our networks. I think the other critical element of open science in the continent is really creation of networks for skills development. There's a lot of capacity gaps, and there are those that can help us train. And when we do trainings, we want to engage all the stakeholders to benefit. And then finally, issues of artificial intelligence are coming to the fore. Everybody's talking about AI.
Yeah.
Everybody's talking about data science, because those are the tools for doing science in the digital space, in the digital era. As AOSP, we are very keen to develop an AI and Data Science Institute to really leverage capacities and advance and support open science in the continent. So briefly, those are the elements of the strategy of AOSP. And as the director of the African Open Science Platform, I direct and coordinate these efforts towards implementation of the strategy. And critically, this involves us working with stakeholders. I think finally, we have a governing council that allows us to also obviously provide oversight into the strategy. But the final point that I also want to make, AOSP is embedded at NRF for a reason. NRF has got capacities in the national science system to also advance open science in South Africa, but most importantly, internally, also within the NRF, with facilities, for example. So there's an inward-looking aspect to AOSP, whereupon we are working with different structures in NRF to also advance open science internally. So really you can see that these are the two mandates, the external African continentalization aspects, global engagement, but internally also promoting open science in NRF.
Okay. When we had a conversation earlier, you touched a lot on culture, even within ourselves. Before we can even go externally, I felt like what you shared was very important because we are together, but culture thing. And also, my question would be: in these dialogues that we're having in this summit, what are the things that you're hoping would come out of it?
This is a very important question. Bottom line is science is done by people on the ground. And we need to help change their culture so that they can embrace this open agenda. And this is tied to progression in their careers. This is tied to incentives in their careers. This is tied to evaluating their work. So really it's very critical that we have mechanisms and strategies for really changing culture. It's a change management issue. And I think it should not really be complicated for scientists because scientists are collaborative by nature. I think it ties in primarily to the notion of progression career-wise. We must incentivize those behaviors that showcase embracement of open science. So I think it's quite critical. So I think also to refer to your question, the conversations today must culminate in tangible way forward. This notion of open scientific knowledge, which is what this pillar today is about, engages stakeholders to come up with creative ways for making sure that scholarly publications are accessed equitably. We know the status quo is not working, where scientists do the science, do the research, do the publishing, they even do peer review. And then we, as institutions where scientists engage, have to pay journals to publish our scientific findings, even after all the processes I've talked about. And our students, to access our articles, have to have our libraries subscribe to journals. So there's a school of thought that says science for public good
Yes.
versus science as a commodity. So the conversations today really is around this diamond open access, which is a modality where those that produce articles and write them and those that want to access them should really not pay. And how do we obviously manage all this? Because in the end, publishing does have some cost. What is the cost? Who should pay it? And can we make it equitable? So what we are hoping from these discussions today is a way forward regarding the science as a public good. There's been conversations in the past, for example, how can we make this work? For example, if you look at South Africa, each university is subscribing to journals. They're paying journal article fees, all sorts. Is it possible to engage as a community and galvanize the little resources that we have and maybe work together to pay for things? That requires obviously conversations around the governance model, requires conversations about the disparities in our NSI, requires us to have a collective effort for aggregating what we've been paying and maybe engaging journals. Now, these are just ideas and they've been talked about for years. So I think what we're hoping out of this is the way forward, that as countries and as regions, how do we then help change the status quo so that we have an equitable, inclusive publishing landscape?
So it seems like, no, it doesn't seem like it is like that. This is the second meeting, and this has been happening for years. I want to ask about progress made so far and future projections about this open access.
No, this is important. This is the second global summit. The first one was in Mexico last year. So I think these are progressive conversations. Remember, the status quo has been there for a very long time. There is now recognition that community efforts are important. Academic community, universities, other stakeholders are beginning to say, look, how can we take control of this space? If you go back maybe hundreds of years ago, the scientists and universities were controlling publishing. But then this was handed over to other players, which is what led to the status quo today. In a way, we are trying to reclaim that space and say how, as communities, as academia, and other well-inclined stakeholders, we can then help reform the current scientific publishing landscape. It will take time, but the dialogue is happening. So hopefully the next step will really set us into the path to do exactly that. I cannot put a timeline on it, but it's baby steps.
So any advice, something you're looking forward to from here, or advice for the delegates that are here? What are you hoping to see in the next 10 years? Even if we don't get to where we want, but which progress would you like to see in the next 10 years?
That's a very good question. In fact, the AU has got Agenda 2063 that talks of where Africa should be in 2063. I think it also applies to these conversations. Where does Africa see itself? The visibility of African science. If you talk to anybody global, they don't think much science is happening in the continent. But there is a lot happening. There are other factors that affect that visibility. So I think I want to see a dispensation where African science is visible. And African scientists are at the forefront of doing science. African scientists are being acknowledged for the science that they are doing, for the science that is happening in the continent. We also have to be very, very optimistic and say, like, science should really also be used for decision making. And at the core of that area we discussed yesterday is the very integrity of science. We know that there is a lot of issues regarding believability of science. Open science is the solution. If you open up your research output, not just your publications, they can be lent to scrutiny. We can then interrogate the science more and also make sure that the integrity is maintained. Then the science that we produce can be used, for example, for decision making, including how to deal with pandemics, how we deal with climate change, because it's a believable science. But that requires our researchers to embrace the open science agenda and embrace the open science methodologies. I would like to see a dispensation going forward where our research assessments methods reflect the fact that we want our science to be believable, and we reward scientists for opening up to this idea of open science. So going forward, also, there are risks with things like artificial intelligence. It's not very uncommon now to see people using ChatGPT to do things. It's also affecting the scientific landscape. How do we, for example, factor into the equation the use of these technologies, and how do we make sure that we are very, very configured to be able to deal with ethics of artificial intelligence in scholarly publications? Going forward, these are areas we cannot avoid. We want to see as the continent be in a position to be able to deal with them.
Thank you so much, Doctor, for your time. And this was very much insightful. And I can attest to the fact that a lot of people, the public, they don't know about these things because you'll be posting your tag that they were like, where are you going? Why are you always away? So we are in the summit in Cape Town and the conversations are still going on Diamond Open Access.